March 3, 1944. The dense jungles of Bougainville Island were alive with shadows and silence, broken only by the distant drone of cicadas and the rustle of unseen movement. A humid mist clung to the earth, curling around shattered palms and rotting bamboo. In the gloom, American infantry crept forward, their rifles lowered, their eyes fixed on the black mouth of a Japanese bunker ahead. The structure was little more than an earthen mound reinforced with logs and steel, yet it radiated menace. Deep inside, unseen defenders waited, rifles and machine guns trained on every approach. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. And then, the silence was ripped apart by a sound unlike any weapon the Japanese had ever faced. It began with a low hiss, like steam escaping from the belly of some mechanical beast. Then came a sudden roar, a tongue of fire leaping forward with unnatural speed, bright orange against the darkness of the foliage. The flamethrower operator braced himself, the twin tanks on his back gleaming with sweat and condensation. The weapon spat liquid fire in a stream that slithered into the bunker's opening. In an instant, the night was gone, replaced by searing daylight born of gasoline and flame. The earth trembled. The air itself seemed to ignite. Within seconds, the fortified position was no longer a haven of steel and soil. It became an inferno. Inside, Japanese soldiers screamed as heat and smoke consumed every corner. Air thickened, oxygen stolen in a blink. Machine guns fell silent, and rifles clattered against charred wood. Men who had sworn to fight to the death now faced an enemy beyond courage, beyond flesh, an enemy that ate the very air from their lungs. Outside, American infantry watched grimly as the flames did their work. There was no firefight, no drawn-out struggle. The bunker had been cleared in less than half a minute. The survivors of nearby positions stared in disbelief. To them, the Americans had unleashed a weapon of sorcery, a demon conjured from metal and oil. Japanese doctrine had prepared them to endure bombardments, to repel infantry assaults, and to weather starvation itself. But this sudden flood of fire that defied sandbags, timber, and even courage, this was something else entirely. A weapon not of bullets or shrapnel, but of terror. Moments later, the jungle fell back into silence. Only smoke lingered, curling skyward from the collapsed bunker. The Flamethrower Man shifted the weight of his tanks and stepped forward again, eyes fixed on the next dark opening hidden beneath the trees. The battle moved on, relentless, but the memory of what the Japanese had just witnessed remained etched in their minds. For centuries, fire had been humanity's most primal fear. Now, in the hands of American infantry, it had been weaponized with industrial precision. The story of that night did not end in the jungle. Survivors whispered it across foxholes, carried it along muddy trails, and etched it into diaries stained with sweat and blood. Japanese officers scribbled frantic reports. Enemy uses device projecting fire. Bunkers rendered useless in seconds. For soldiers raised on Bushido, on the idea that spirit could overcome steel, this revelation was almost incomprehensible. Spirit could not extinguish flamed as the Americans advanced. More bunkers met the same fate. The pattern repeated like a nightmare. The hiss, the roar, the sudden flood of orange light, and then silence. Some Japanese soldiers fired blindly at the flamethrower operators, desperate to kill the man carrying the tanks. Others simply froze, paralyzed by the knowledge that their stronghold could vanish in a burst of fire. The fear was contagious. One position fell, and the next collapsed under the weight of anticipation alone. For the Americans, too, the weapon carried its own aura. The Flamethrower Man was a figure both respected and feared by his comrades. He carried no rifle, no shield, only fire strapped to his back, a target that drew every bullet within range. Yet he walked forward again and again, knowing that one shot could turn his tanks into a funeral pyre. His bravery was measured not only in the flames he unleashed, but also in the silence he endured afterward. Haunted by the faces he had burned from the world, the battlefield itself bore witness. Trees scorched black, roots glowing red beneath the soil, the air poisoned by acrid smoke. Where once there had been bunkers, there were now only charred pits, smelling of gasoline and despair. And in those smoldering ruins lay the shattered remains of a doctrine. Japanese engineers had designed bunkers to be impenetrable by rifle fire, resistant to mortars, and even capable of withstanding direct artillery. Yet against a weapon that bypassed armor and earth, all calculations failed. By dawn, the jungle of Bougainville was transformed. American units pressed forward, buoyed by the speed with which obstacles had collapsed. They moved not with hesitation but with grim determination, their path cleared by fire. Behind them, smoke hung low, drifting like a shroud over the bodies of men who had once believed their fortifications were eternal. The sun rose, illuminating a landscape scarred by flames and casting long shadows over the still smoking earthworks. The whispers of that day grew into warnings across the Pacific. From Bougainville to Saipan, from Peleliu to Iwo Jima, Japanese defenders began to brace themselves for a weapon they could neither match nor counter. They built bunkers deeper and reinforced them with steel, yet still the fire came. They dug escape tunnels, only to find flames chasing them into darkness. In time, even the most hardened veterans admitted a truth they could scarcely believe. No bunker was safe anymore. The flamethrower had rewritten the rules of close combat. Where once hours of bloody assault might be required, now victory could be achieved in seconds. For the Americans, this meant progress. For the Japanese, it meant dread. Each bunker ceased to be a fortress and became a trap, a waiting coffin. One spark away from annihilation. On that humid night in March 1944, the battlefield bore witness to more than the destruction of a single bunker. It revealed the dawn of a weapon that would haunt the Pacific War until its bitter end. Fire had become a soldier, silent until summoned, merciless once unleashed. And for those who faced it, belief, courage, and tradition crumbled before its searing touch. The jungle closed in again, as if to hide what had been done. But the memory remained, etched into every survivor's mind, whispered in every corner of the Pacific. The Japanese had believed in their bunkers. They believed in their steel, their timber, and their soil. That night, they learned belief alone could not stand against fire. By 1943, the Pacific War had entered a brutal new stage. The Japanese Empire, once a relentless tide sweeping across Asia and the Pacific, now found itself fighting a desperate defensive struggle. The United States, with its industrial might fully awakened, had seized the initiative. Island by island, reef by reef, the American juggernaut advanced closer to Japan's home waters. Yet this was no easy path. The Japanese had transformed every atoll, every volcanic ridge, and every patch of jungle into a fortress on the black sands of Tarawa. The Americans had learned the cost of underestimating Japanese defenses. Bunkers reinforced with palm logs, coral, and concrete had turned a tiny island into a killing ground. Machine guns scythed through advancing Marines. Mortar shells rained destruction on the beaches. At Peleliu, men swore the ground itself seemed alive, bristling with hidden tunnels and firing ports. The Japanese doctrine was simple: defend every inch, inflict maximum casualties, and fight to the death. They believed fortifications could offset America's overwhelming firepower. These defenses were not mere positions. They were symbols of Japanese willpower. A bunker was more than wood and steel. It was the embodiment of the Bushido spirit, a place where a handful of men could hold off an army. In their minds, fortifications would force the Americans to bleed for every yard, to break their spirit before they broke Japan. For a time, it worked. Casualties mounted, assaults bogged down, and every step forward seemed paid for in rivers of blood. But the Americans adapted. Their commanders studied every bunker system, every cave network. They learned that artillery alone could not always silence these fortresses. Even naval bombardments sometimes failed to crack the earth and steel hives. Infantrymen would approach cautiously, lobbing grenades and satchel charges, but the Japanese would endure. Once the smoke cleared, machine guns barked again from the same openings. The struggle became a grim pattern: attack, withdrawal, regroup, attack again. Progress was measured in feet, not miles. The psychological toll was immense. For Marines storming a beach or soldiers advancing through jungle, the knowledge that each mound of dirt might conceal a machine gun nest was suffocating. The Japanese relied on this, believing fear itself was as powerful as bullets. Their fortifications were designed not only to kill, but also to erode morale, to make every step forward feel hopeless. Yet even as Japanese doctrine hardened, cracks began to appear. The Americans introduced new tools and new tactics. Engineers devised explosives to shatter log walls. Tanks were brought up to blast bunkers point-blank with their cannons. Demolition teams crept forward with satchel charges. Still, none of these solutions provided the swiftness or certainty needed. Too often, men had to charge directly into the line of fire, paying with their lives to silence a single bunker. Then came the flamethrower. Its arrival was not entirely unexpected. Flame weapons had existed for centuries, from ancient fire pots to German Flammenwerfers of World War I. But in the Pacific, the device found its true battlefield purpose. The M1 and later M2 flamethrowers issued to American forces were ungainly, heavy, and terrifying even to their operators. But they held a power unlike anything else. Where explosives shattered walls and bullets pierced bodies, flames seeped into every crevice, consuming oxygen, sowing panic, and rendering fortifications instantly untenable. The broader war context magnified its impact. In North Africa, tank battles decided the fate of deserts. In Europe, artillery and armor clashed across vast plains. But in the Pacific, the war was intimate and suffocating, fought yard by yard in jungles and caves. Here, the flamethrower was not just effective, it was devastating. It bypassed the very principles of Japanese fortification. No matter how thick the logs or how deep the soil, fire could snake its way inside. Japanese commanders realized too late that their doctrine had a fatal flaw. The very structures they built to shield their men became death traps when fire arrived. Ventilation shafts became chimneys. Escape tunnels became ovens. And every soldier inside was bound to his post by honor, unwilling to flee, unable to survive. The clash of doctrines was stark. Japanese strategy relied on endurance and sacrifice, on the belief that fortifications and spirit could delay the American advance indefinitely. American strategy embraced innovation, using technology to neutralize advantages and save lives. Where the Japanese asked their men to die in their bunkers, the Americans asked their engineers to invent ways to destroy those bunkers. The contrast was not lost on the men themselves. Survivors from Tarawa, Peleliu, and later Iwo Jima carried with them stories of the fire weapon that could erase in seconds what had been built over months. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated to believe they could resist anything, wrote in diaries of their disbelief. The enemy carries fire like water, one entry red. Our strongholds melt like wax before them. By 1944, the balance of power in the Pacific was shifting irreversibly. The Japanese still fought ferociously, but their confidence in fortifications began to waver. Reports from the front lines grew increasingly desperate. Flame-throwing weapons cannot be resisted, one officer warned. Entire units were annihilated in bunkers that once promised invincibility. Meanwhile, American troops adjusted their doctrine around the weapon. Flamethrowers were paired with rifles and grenades in combined assaults. Tanks were modified to carry larger flame projectors, turning into mobile infernos that could clear swathes of jungle in minutes. The battlefield was no longer defined by who could endure longer, but by who could unleash devastation faster. Thus, the stage was set. A war of fortresses against fire. A doctrine of endurance against a doctrine of innovation. And as the Americans pressed forward, island by island, the Japanese soldiers who once trusted their bunkers with their lives would come to fear the hiss and roar that signaled their doom. The Pacific had become not just a theater of war, but a crucible of adaptation. And within that crucible, the flamethrower would emerge as one of the most fearsome symbols of America's relentless advance. The mystery of the Americans' sudden ability to reduce bunkers to ashes was not immediately understood by the Japanese. To them, it was as though their enemy had uncovered some ancient secret, some forbidden element of war that transcended the steel and soil they trusted with their lives. For years, imperial engineers had poured their faith into fortifications. Pillboxes carved from coral, bunkers buried beneath volcanic rock, and labyrinthine tunnels that turned mountains into fortresses. These structures were meant to defy artillery, to laugh at rifle fire, and to endure even the shock of naval bombardment. And for a time, they did. But then the Americans arrived with a weapon that seemed to render all of it meaningless. The hidden advantage lay in the M2 flamethrower, an ungainly device that looked more like a piece of farm equipment than a weapon of war. Strapped to the back of a single soldier, its twin cylinders carried a mixture of gasoline and napalm thickener. A hose and nozzle extended outward, ending in a trigger assembly that could project a stream of burning liquid up to 40 yards. To the Japanese, the very concept was alien. They had studied American rifles, tanks, and artillery, but they had not accounted for fire itself being harnessed so ruthlessly, so methodically. It was not simply the physical devastation that unsettled them. It was the psychological effect. A flamethrower operator did not merely kill. He transformed the battlefield itself. Darkness was replaced with light, silence with roaring flame. Bunkers that had been havens became ovens. A single burst could silence a dozen defenders, not because the flame reached them all, but because terror did the rest. The Japanese soldiers had been trained to resist bullets and shrapnel, but nothing in their doctrine had prepared them for fire crawling into every corner of their defenses. This was the Americans' hidden edge, not superior armor, not overwhelming artillery, but a weapon that exploited the one weakness no bunker could cover: air. Oxygen, the very essence of survival, was devoured in seconds by the flamethrower's spray. Men suffocated even before flames touched them. The Japanese called it unnatural, a dishonorable weapon, but their protests changed nothing. Their strongest positions crumbled with frightening speed, and their soldiers began to whisper of the fire tanks that no courage could resist. What made the advantage even more devastating was how seamlessly the Americans integrated it into their infantry tactics. A flamethrower was never sent alone. Riflemen shielded the operator, grenadiers cleared paths, and engineers marked targets. Radios crackled with coordination, allowing squads to direct flamethrowers precisely where they were needed. Against such combined arms, even the fiercest bunker lines seemed brittle. The Japanese tried to adapt. They dug deeper bunkers, reinforced roofs with steel beams, and carved escape tunnels leading into the jungle. But none of these measures provided certainty. Flame, unlike bullets, curved and flowed. It slithered around corners, seeped into cracks, and licked through ventilation shafts. A position thought invulnerable would suddenly ignite from within. Escape tunnels became death traps as fire raced along their length, pursuing men into darkness they thought would shield them. More than the destruction of physical defenses, the flamethrower eroded the very spirit of resistance. In earlier campaigns, Japanese officers could rally their men with speeches of honor, reminding them that machine guns and artillery could be endured, that pain could be mastered. But against fire, such words rang hollow. Even the bravest soldiers found themselves recoiling from the hiss and roar, knowing instinctively what awaited inside the flames. American soldiers, too, recognized the weapon's power. Flamethrower operators were both revered and pitted. They were targets of every Japanese sniper, yet indispensable to every assault. Within the ranks, they carried an aura of grim respect. The man with fire was both executioner and savior. His burden was immense, his survival uncertain, but his presence meant the difference between progress and stalemate. The Japanese intelligence network struggled to interpret this hidden advantage. Reports described American fire weapons with disbelief, some officers dismissing them as exaggerations. Others speculated about magical fuels or hidden machinery. Few could grasp the simplicity: a tank of fuel, a pump, and ignition. The weapon was terrifying not because it was complex, but because it was brutally efficient. The hidden advantage was not just in the weapon itself, but in the mindset behind it. The Americans sought solutions, however unorthodox, to minimize their own casualties. Where Japanese commanders sacrificed men to preserve ground, Americans sacrificed ingenuity to preserve lives. In this clash of philosophies, the flamethrower symbolized the larger war. One side placed faith in tradition and endurance. The other placed faith in innovation and pragmatism. By the time the Japanese began to understand what they faced, it was too late. Their bunkers, once thought eternal, were now liabilities. Entire garrisons learned to dread the telltale sound of a fuel nozzle clicking open. Rumors spread faster than fire itself. Bunkers cleared in seconds, strong points erased by a single man. The hidden advantage had become more than a weapon. It was a legend, one that marched ahead of the Americans like a phantom, sapping morale before the first shot was fired. This revelation shook the confidence of Japanese troops across the Pacific. At Peleliu, at Saipan, and at Iwo Jima, defenders entered battle already haunted by the thought of flame. They tightened their grips on rifles, and they recited oaths of loyalty, but in the quiet recesses of their minds, they knew no bunker was truly safe. The Americans had unlocked something primal, something that could not be resisted by courage or calculation. And in this realization, the Japanese understood a bitter truth. Their belief in fortifications had been their downfall. What they had built to shield them had instead become the instruments of their destruction. The Americans had found the hidden advantage that turned earth and steel into kindling, and once revealed, it would burn through the Pacific until the war's final days. The weapon itself was a contradiction, primitive in concept, yet refined with the precision of American engineering. To the untrained eye, the M2 flamethrower looked ungainly, almost clumsy, a pair of steel cylinders strapped to a man's back, connected to a hose and wand. But inside that crude silhouette lay a devastating instrument of war, designed with meticulous detail to unleash fire as a controllable stream rather than a chaotic blaze. Each tank weighed heavily on the operator, together tipping the scale at nearly 70 pounds when filled. One cylinder carried nitrogen gas under high pressure, the other a thickened fuel mixture, gasoline blended with napalm compounds that clung like liquid fire to any surface it touched. A handheld nozzle assembly allowed the operator to direct this inferno, while a small ignition system at the muzzle sparked the fuel as it left the barrel. With a pull of the trigger, the weapon roared to life, hurling a stream of flame as far as 40 yards, sweeping across jungle foliage or straight into the dark mouths of bunkers. This range alone made the weapon revolutionary. The German Fug flame projectors of World War I had barely reached 20 yards and required teams of men to operate. The American M2, by contrast, could be wielded by a single soldier, maneuverable in the thick jungle, its flame hot enough to ignite wood, earth, and even steel supports. For Japanese defenders, no opening was safe. A slit in the wall, a vent in the roof, and a tunnel mouth all became pathways for fire. The chemistry behind the weapon was equally terrifying. The napalm mixture thickened the gasoline, transforming it into a sticky, liquid fire that clung to surfaces. Unlike raw fuel, which might splash and burn out, napalm hugged the walls of bunkers, seeped into cracks, and burned at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. A soldier doused in the spray had no hope of extinguishing it. Even stone walls grew blistered and blackened under its heat. This was not merely fire. It was fire made obedient, harnessed to a soldier's command. Production numbers reflected the United States industrial scale. By 1943, American factories were producing tens of thousands of flamethrowers, distributed to both Marines and Army infantry across the Pacific. The weapon was not rare or experimental. It was standard issue, carried ashore in every major amphibious landing. From the sands of Saipan to the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima, American squads advanced with at least one flamethrower operator, ready to clear whatever fortress stood in their way. Behind these weapons stood names less famous than generals, but no less critical. Laboratories like Harvard's Chemical Engineering Department refined the napalm compounds. Industrial giants like General Electric supplied the ignition systems. Thousands of anonymous factory workers in Detroit and Pittsburgh assembled the tanks, hoses, and valves that transformed chemistry into battlefield terror. What emerged was a weapon born of science and industry, yet wielded by flesh-and-blood men in the most intimate combat imaginable. The Japanese, by comparison, had little to answer with. Their Type 93 flamethrower was cumbersome, unreliable, and produced only a short spurt of fire with limited range. Its fuel often failed to ignite properly in humid climates, and its design left operators dangerously exposed. Japanese commanders quickly realized that their own flame weapons were inadequate, and their soldiers instead faced a nightmare they could not replicate. The imbalance was stark. What had once been a duel of rifles and machine guns had now become a one-sided contest of fire against fear. Even the specifications themselves carried weight in the larger narrative of war. The M2's fuel mixture could burn for up to 7 seconds in a continuous stream or be fired in short bursts to conserve fuel. Each tank provided enough for multiple assaults, though its weight meant the operator was often exhausted after only minutes of action. The ignition was electric, powered by a battery carried on the operator's back, reliable even in the damp jungles of the South Pacific. These details mattered. A misfire could mean death for the operator. A jammed nozzle could spell disaster for his squad. And yet, time and again, the system worked with brutal reliability. The integration of flamethrowers into armored vehicles magnified their destructive potential. Engineers refitted Sherman tanks with mechanized flame projectors, creating the feared flame tanks that could hurl fire over 100 yards. These machines combined armor, mobility, and inferno in a single chassis. Against them, even the most elaborate bunker systems withered. Japanese soldiers called them hell tanks, recognizing them as the embodiment of unstoppable destruction. Technical superiority alone did not explain the weapon's impact. It was the way the Americans wielded it that mattered. Flamethrowers were never random instruments. They were precise, aimed deliberately into openings, caves, and dugouts. Their operators were trained to conserve fuel and to sweep systematically, ensuring no defender survived. Each burst was calculated, every jet of flame guided by doctrine as much as instinct. The result was a weapon that blended engineering and psychology, annihilation and intimidation. The battlefield told the story in black scars and twisted ruins. Palm trunks charred into skeletal remains. Steel beams warped by heat. Earth hardened into glassy crusts where the flame had burned longest. Survivors staggered from bunkers not with wounds alone, but with eyes wide in disbelief and faces etched with terror. For Japanese intelligence officers, it was impossible to ignore. Reports cataloged the specifications, range, duration, fuel type, but always with a note of desperation. Our defenses cannot withstand. American commanders recognized the advantage. General Holland Smith, architect of multiple marine landings, called the flamethrower the most effective single weapon against Japanese bunkers. Soldiers echoed the sentiment in letters home, describing how fortifications that once swallowed entire platoons were now cleared in seconds. For every Japanese bunker annihilated, dozens of American lives were spared, and yet, the burden on the men who carried them remained profound. The technical perfection of the weapon could not erase the human cost. Operators spoke in hushed tones of what they had seen. Enemies screaming, bunkers glowing like furnaces, and shadows writhing in flame. Some carried guilt long after the war, haunted not by statistics, but by memories. The engineering marvel had achieved its purpose, but at a moral price that could never be measured in steel or fueled in the clash of doctrines and machines. The flamethrower stood as proof of America's hidden advantage, the ability to turn science into a weapon that not only destroyed the body, but also the spirit. To the Japanese soldier crouched inside his bunker, the specifications did not matter: the weight of tanks, the pressure off nitrogen, or the wattage of ignition. What mattered was the sudden roar, the rush of heat, and the knowledge that his sanctuary had become a tomb. September 15, 1944. The island of Peleliu, a jagged coral speck in the Pacific, baked under an unforgiving sun. The air shimmered with heat, and the ground cracked beneath the boots of advancing Marines. For weeks, intelligence had promised a swift campaign, a matter of days before the Japanese garrison collapsed. But what unfolded was something else entirely. Beneath the ridges and ridgelines, inside caves and bunkers, the defenders had dug in with fanatical resolve. By the second day, the Marines realized this was not a battle off days but of weeks, and the cost would be staggering. On the Ymerbergal Ridge, nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge, Japanese bunkers stared out from the coral cliffs like the eyes of a predator. Machine gun nests spat fire across every approach. Mortar shells rained down from hidden pits, and each step forward demanded a sacrifice of blood. Marines attacked again and again, only to be thrown back by the ferocity of the defenders. For every ridge taken, another opened behind it, bristling with guns and shadows. Then came the flamethrowers, Marine squads. Pinned down by overlapping arcs of fire, called forward the men with tanks strapped to their backs. One operator, his face blackened with sweat and grime, crept to the edge of a bunker mouth. Bullets cracked overhead, ricocheting from coral. He crouched low, aimed his nozzle, and squeezed. A jet of flames surged forward, slamming into the opening. The entire interior was lit in an instant, smoke billowing outward like the breath of some angry god. Within seconds, the machine guns went silent. When the Marines rushed in, they found only charred weapons and bodies. The effect was immediate and shocking. Positions that had resisted for hours collapsed in mere moments. At Peleliu, flamethrowers became the spearhead of every assault. Riflemen pinned down defenders, engineers marked the targets, and the operators advanced with fire. Bunkers fell in rapid succession, each cleared by the hiss and roar of liquid flame. The Japanese defenders, who had once mocked the American reliance on machines, now found themselves powerless before this terrible invention. One Japanese diary recovered after the battle described the moment with chilling simplicity. The enemy's fire weapon enters everywhere. The cave becomes a grave. It was not an exaggeration. Caves that had been built as sanctuaries turned into furnaces. Even men who survived the initial blast often died from suffocation, the oxygen consumed by the firestorm. Those who escaped stumbled into the open, disoriented, only to be cut down by waiting Marines. The statistics told the story. On Peleliu, entire companies of Japanese defenders were annihilated in their bunkers without inflicting comparable casualties. Where once dozens of Marines might have been lost storming a single position, flamethrowers turned the balance. At one strong point, 40 Japanese soldiers were eliminated in less than 3 minutes by a single flamethrower team. Losses that had once been measured in platoons were now measured in seconds. The Battle of Iwo Jima months later carried this grim efficiency to its peak. The island was honeycombed with more than 11 miles of tunnel, bunkers, and caves. General Kurabayashi had designed it to bleed the Americans dry. His men waited in hidden positions, immune to bombardment, ready to unleash devastation when the invasion began. And for days, they did. The beaches turned red, the air filled with lead, and the Marines paid dearly for every inch. But the flamethrowers changed the tempo. Again and again, Marines cornered Japanese defenders in caves, poured flame inside, and silenced resistance. The roar of flame tanks became as constant as the thunder of artillery. Iwo Jima was not conquered bunker by bunker, but burned bunker by bunker. The Japanese fought with suicidal determination, but their fortifications betrayed them. What had been built to protect became cages of death when fire entered. Reports from the battle paint a stark picture. At Hill 382, a fortified sector of Iwo Jima, Marine units advanced with flamethrowers at the vanguard. Caves that had resisted days of bombardment were cleared in minutes. In one sector alone, 300 Japanese defenders were incinerated or suffocated. After-action documents recorded the devastation with clinical detachment. Enemy position neutralized by flame. Resistance ceased. But the reality was anything but clinical. The smell of burning fuel clung to the air, the ground was scorched black, and the cries of the dying echoed from inside caves. German observers in Europe, reading captured reports, were stunned by the descriptions. They had built their doctrine on steel and armor, but here was something else, a weapon that bypassed both. For the Japanese soldiers in the Pacific, it was a daily nightmare. Survivors wrote of the unbearable heat, of comrades clawing at walls as fire consumed their lungs. One officer confessed in his journal, "We cannot fight against this. The fire eats all." The aftershock of these battles extended beyond the front lines. Japanese commanders, desperate to preserve morale, downplayed the impact of flamethrowers in official communiques. Yet the whispers spread regardless. Soldiers in remote garrisons heard of bunkers destroyed in seconds, of entire units erased by fire. Fear traveled faster than fact, and soon every soldier entering a bunker carried the weight of that knowledge. For the Americans, the weapon was not only effective but also symbolic. At Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, it represented a turning of the tide, proof that no fortress was beyond reach. Flamethrowers gave infantrymen a weapon that matched the terrain, a tool that allowed them to break the stalemate of bunker warfare. In letters home, Marines described the relief of watching once impregnable strongholds collapse. "We have the devil's own tool now," one wrote. And it works. The numbers were undeniable. At Iwo Jima, over 800 Japanese positions were destroyed by flamethrowers and flame tanks. Kill ratios tilted heavily in the Americans' favor. Bunkers that had once cost hundreds of lives could now be neutralized by a handful of men with fuel tanks. The cost was still high, but without the flamethrower, it would have been catastrophic in the end. These battles became case studies in the power of innovation. Peleliu showed the shock of the weapon's first widespread use. Iwo Jima demonstrated its strategic necessity. Okinawa confirmed its role as the final arbiter of fortified warfare in the Pacific. For Japanese soldiers who once believed in the unbreakable strength of their defenses, the flamethrower was the cruelest revelation. Not even courage could stand against fire. And for the Americans, it was the proof of their hidden advantage, an advantage that turned the very earthworks of their enemy into kindling for victory. The battlefield was not just a place of steel and smoke. It was a crucible of the mind. By 1944, Japanese troops had already endured unimaginable hardship, disease, hunger, and endless bombardment. Yet even the most battle-hardened veterans found themselves faltering when the hiss of a flamethrower ignited the air. The weapon did not merely destroy bunkers. It shattered the psychology of resistance itself. When a machine gun nest fell silent under rifle fire, the Japanese could explain it: superior numbers, heavier weapons, chance. But when an entire bunker vanished in a storm of fire within seconds, explanations faltered. Men who had sworn to fight to the death staggered from tunnels screaming, not in defiance, but in terror. Others chose suicide rather than face the flame, pulling grenades against their chests before the fire reached them. The Bushido Code, drilled into every soldier, cracked under the reality of liquid fire that no spirit could repel. American commanders recognized this psychological fracture. They learned that deploying flamethrowers early in an assault could break the enemies well before the firefight began. Once defenders witnessed a neighboring bunker consumed, panic spread. Communication lines collapsed. Officers struggled to rally their men, and what had been an organized defense unraveled into chaos. Fire, more than bullets, severed the invisible threads that bound soldiers to their posts. Reports from Okinawa described defenders abandoning strongpoints at the mere sight of flame tanks approaching. Others fired wildly, revealing their positions in desperation, only to be silenced moments later. The fear of fire was universal and instinctive, and the Americans wielded it like a scalpel. Flamethrowers did not just clear bunkers, they cleared morale. Strategically, the impact was profound. The Pacific Campaign was a war of attrition, every island a fortress, every ridge a killing ground. Japanese doctrine depended on delaying the Americans long enough to exhaust their will. But flamethrowers compressed battles. Where a single bunker might once tie down a battalion for hours, now it could be neutralized in minutes. The effect rippled outward. Faster progress meant fewer casualties, fewer delays, and more relentless pressure. Every bunker destroyed by fire shortened the campaign, undercutting the very strategy Japan had built its defense upon. The Americans, meanwhile, felt the opposite effect. For them, the flamethrower was a source of grim confidence. Marines who had once dreaded charging fortified positions now advanced with the assurance that their squads carried a weapon capable of breaking the stalemate. Letters home spoke of relief that their brothers in arms had fire on their side. It was not joy, not pride, but the knowledge that survival no longer required endless waves of sacrifice. And yet, the burden was heavy. Flamethrower operators bore not only the physical risk of carrying volatile tanks, but also the psychological weight of what they unleashed. They watched enemies burn alive, heard screams echoing in caves, and smelled flesh and fuel mingled in the air. Some confessed long after the war that they felt more like executioners than soldiers. Comrades respected them, but also kept a quiet distance, aware that the man with fire carried memories darker than most. Still, the advantage could not be ignored. In a war where logistics and morale determined victory as much as firepower, the flamethrower tipped the balance. Japanese commanders wrote in despairing tones of units crumbling under flame attacks. Some urged their men to dig deeper, to hold longer, but such exhortations rang hollow. Even the most loyal troops knew that deeper tunnels only delayed the inevitable. The The fire would find them sooner or later. The strategic shock extended beyond the battlefield. Japanese propaganda, once triumphant in extolling the indomitable will of their soldiers, faltered when confronted with reports of mass incineration. Stories spread among civilians and soldiers alike, tales of entire companies lost to flame in a matter of minutes. Fear seeped into the collective psyche of the empire. The very idea of impregnable fortifications, once a pillar of Japan's defensive strategy, was eroded by whispers of bunkers turned into tombs. For the Americans, the impact was equally significant in shaping doctrine. Commanders adapted their assault plans to integrate flamethrowers as essential rather than auxiliary. Tanks were retrofitted with mechanized flamethrowers, providing mobile firepower that could clear ridges and caves from hundreds of yards away. Infantry squads were trained to protect flame operators as vital assets, their survival often dictating the success of an assault. In this way, the flamethrower became not just a weapon but a cornerstone of strategy. Beyond tactics, the weapon carried symbolic weight. It represented the broader difference in philosophy between the two sides. Japan clung to tradition and sacrifice, building fortifications as monuments to endurance. America embraced innovation, wielding technology to bypass suffering. In that contrast lay the deeper truth of the war, that adaptability, not stubbornness, would decide its outcome. The psychological toll on Japanese soldiers was perhaps the most devastating legacy of all. Survivors of flame attacks often bore scars, not only physical but also mental, haunted by the memory of comrades consumed before their eyes. Diaries recovered from bunkers spoke of nightmares, of the dread of hearing the hiss of fuel igniting, and of the certainty that flame meant death without honor. Some even prayed for artillery barges instead, preferring the impersonal crush of shells to the intimate horror of fire. By Okinawa, this dread had matured into resignation. Entire garrisons collapsed faster than expected, not because their fortifications were weak, but because their spirit was broken before the first shot. The flamethrower had become more than a weapon. It was a psychological storm that preceded the Americans wherever they landed. And for Japanese soldiers who once believed that fortifications could stand forever, this was the most unbearable defeat of all. In the end, the flamethrower's true impact was not measured in bunkers destroyed or men killed, but in minds broken. It undermined the very foundations of Japanese strategy, replacing faith in earth and steel with a gnawing certainty: no defense could withstand fire. In that realization lay the unraveling of an empire's resolve, and the triumph of a weapon designed as much to terrify as to kill. When the war in the Pacific finally drew to its bitter close in August 1945, the memory of fire lingered across the islands like smoke that refused to clear. From the charred ridges of Peleliu to the scorched caves of Iwo Jima, the flamethrower had left behind not only ashes but also lessons etched into the conscience of armies. Japanese soldiers, once so certain that courage and fortification could withstand any storm, had been forced to accept a truth more enduring than steel. Fire ignores walls, consumes spirit, and rewrites the very logic of war. The legacy of the flamethrower was immediate and undeniable. American commanders credited it with saving thousands of lives during the island-hopping campaigns. General Holland Smith declared it the most effective single weapon against Japanese defenses, a verdict echoed in countless after-action reports. Marines who had clawed their way through bunkers without flame knew firsthand the difference. With rifles and grenades, progress had been measured in hours of bloody stalemate. With fire, the same ground was seized in minutes. The balance sheet of survival tilted heavily in the Americans' favor, but beyond tactics, the weapon shaped strategy itself. By demonstrating that even the strongest fortifications could be annihilated in seconds, flamethrowers shattered the Japanese reliance on static defenses. Their doctrine of hold every inch became all ability. Their bunkers transformed into tombs. And as the Americans advanced closer to Japan's home islands, the lesson became inescapable. Fortification without adaptation was suicide. This principle outlived the war. In the Cold War that followed, military theorists studied the Pacific campaigns with intense scrutiny. They saw how technology, when integrated into combined arms doctrine, could demolish even the most entrenched positions. Flame weapons were refined, mounted on vehicles, and scaled into massive mechanized systems. The flame tank, once a field improvisation, became a standard of armored doctrine for decades. Armies from the Soviet Union to NATO integrated flame projectors into their arsenals, recognizing that terror could be as decisive as firepower. Even in conflicts far from the Pacific, echoes of the flamethrower could be heard. In Korea, in Vietnam, and in the Gulf War, the principle endured. Speed, innovation, and psychological dominance outweighed brute strength. Modern militaries no longer carried backpack flamethrowers into combat, but the lesson remained. Napalm canisters dropped from aircraft, thermobaric weapons detonated in caves, fuel-air explosives consuming oxygen with devastating force. All were descendants of that terrible hiss and roar first heard in the jungles of Bougainville. For the Japanese, the legacy was darker. Survivors who returned from the Pacific carried scars, physical and invisible. Diaries written in trembling hands spoke of nightmares filled with fire, of comrades clawing at walls as flame devoured air. Officers reflected bitterly that their reliance on fortifications had betrayed them, that they had underestimated the American willingness to innovate. Field Marshal Keitel of Germany, reflecting on parallel lessons in Europe, put it bluntly, "We built better tanks, but you built tanks that work together." In the Pacific, the echo was clear. The Japanese built stronger bunkers, but the Americans built weapons that ignored them. The psychological reverberations extended into Japanese society itself. For a culture steeped in the honor of resistance, the humiliation of bunkers erased by flame left a wound unspoken but deep. The myth of invulnerability had been exposed, ace in illusion. Fire had not only destroyed fortresses, it had stripped away faith. Yet for the Americans, the weapon carried its own burden. Veterans who carried flamethrowers spoke rarely of their experiences. Many were haunted by what they had seen. Men consumed in seconds, screams echoing from caves, and the smell of burning flesh clinging to their uniforms. They had carried a weapon that ended battles quickly, but at a cost that lingered long after victory. Some never forgave themselves for what necessity had demanded. The flamethrower was efficient, but it was also intimate. Unlike artillery or bombs dropped from miles away, its victims were close enough to see, to hear, and to haunt. And so, its legacy is one of contradiction. To military historians, the flamethrower stands as a symbol of American ingenuity, a weapon that embodied the ability to adapt and overcome. To soldiers, it was a tool of survival, a grim necessity that spared their comrades at the cost of unbearable sights. To Japanese defenders, it was terror incarnate, the death-off doctrine, and the collapse of certainty. To the modern world, it remains a reminder that war is not won by strength alone, but by the willingness to think differently, to wield fire against stone, and fear against courage. The evolution of warfare since has only deepened that truth. Network-centric warfare, drone swarms, and cyber conflict, each reflects the same principle revealed in the Pacific jungles. Connection outweighs isolation. Innovation defeats endurance, and speed conquers armor. The flamethrower was not merely a weapon of 1944. It was a prophecy of wars to come, a demonstration that the side willing to harness terror and technology would hold the decisive edge. Today, the image endures, a lone Marine advancing through smoke, tanks heavy on his back, nozzle in hand. The hiss, the roar, the sudden flood of fire. The bunker collapsing into silence. It is a scene at once triumphant and horrifying, a scene that captures the paradox of modern war, that survival sometimes demands unleashing forces too terrible to forget. And in that paradox lies the final lesson. Fortifications may crumble, and courage may falter, but innovation endures. Fire, once humanity's oldest ally, had been turned into its deadliest soldier. In the Pacific, it consumed bunkers, doctrines, and illusions alike. And it left behind a truth that resonates still. In war, it is not always the strongest who prevail, but those who can set the battlefield itself ablaze.